My name is Jacob Burton. I'm the executive chef of Stella Restaurant and the Cedar House Sport Hotel. And real quick, before we jump into our week-long adventure, I want to give you a little bit of background of what we're going to be doing here this week and how this all came about. So, let me tell you a little story about how a coconut macaroon changed my life. When I first met my wife and we were dating, we'd been together for about 4 months, her favorite treat was the coconut macaroon. And at that point, I was a decent cook. I hadn't gone to culinary school. I didn't know that much about cooking. I had maybe 10 dishes that I was comfortable with, that I felt that I could serve to people and they'd enjoy if they came over to eat. But I could follow recipes, so that was basically what I was capable of doing in the kitchen. So one day, I'm at home, it's my day off, and I'm watching the Food Network. And they got someone making a coconut macaroon. And they're like, oh yeah, it's real easy. It's mixed together, you fold the ingredients, you mold it, you put it on the little pan, you press the bake button, 15 minutes later, it's all good, right? And they show you the money shot at the end where they break open the coconut macaroon, you're like, oh, that looks awesome, yeah, great, I can do that. So I go online, I go to the website where they refer you at the end of the show. Like, go to this website, check this out, make this recipe. So I make it. It comes out horrible. It's disgusting. I'm like, oh, man, I missed something. I don't bake that much. I screw up the recipe. Okay. So I make it again. And then the second time it doesn't come out. I'm like, oh. Okay, so I'm going to make it one more time. So I make it a third time. Third time, I follow the recipe to the T. Double check everything. I mean, literally, it took me about 30 minutes just to mix the ingredients because I was double checking everything, right? Third time it was awful. And I remember the rage that I felt. I mean, I was in rage. I felt betrayed. They gave me a bum recipe, right? I wasted half of a day trying to make coconut macaroons, which, by the way, I don't even like. I was doing it for my girlfriend who I wanted to impress, and they didn't give me the tools to troubleshoot. So I felt very intellectually insulted. You give me a bum recipe, you don't explain to me why you mix ingredients, why you bake it like this, and now your bum recipe is useless because I don't even understand. Like, how do I fix this? So literally, I went to culinary school the next week. Well, I signed up the next week. And I was in college, I was bored, so I was like, whatever. Let's take a dive off the cliff and see where this leads us. Well, it led me to my philosophy of technique is king. Understanding of food is king. Because cooks, whether you're a professional cook in the kitchen just starting out, or you're a cook at home, you're so dependent upon recipes, on other people's recipes. And if you do enough of the same recipe time and time again, you build this intuition, this sense for it. And then you can start to make it your own. But once you have a deep technical understanding of that recipe, then you can create your own recipes. So what I have here is the F-Step curriculum. It's a curriculum that I formulated specifically to brainwash you, to make you think like a chef, to kind of break that mold of, hey, I want to cook beef bourguignon tonight, so I need to go find the beef bourguignon recipe in one of my 100 cookbooks. It's like, no, I understand fundamentally what beef bourguignon is, the technique behind it, and what makes it good. And also, when it comes out bad, you're going to have the understanding of like, oh, this is where I went wrong. Because cooking, even though it seems like a creative process, and it is, what's great about cooking is it's very formulaic, and the outcome is very simple. And that's one of the things I really love about my job, is the honesty of it, right? I can sit there and bore you about all the different components, all the technical details that went into a dish, but if you put it in your mouth and it sucks, it sucks. There's no way around that. And that comes from technical error, execution error, flavor error, okay? So I'm going to write this formula on the board. So our formula that's just going to be drilled into you time and time again this week is flavor plus technique in parentheses times execution equals something. Okay? Now this is important because, so you have your flavor, which we're going to talk today all about flavor. Today's our flavor lecture. So your flavor can be thought of as what you're going to cook. You got to decide, okay, I'm going to make a beef dish. Okay, so that's your flavor, and you have complementary flavors that go along with that. Okay, then you're going to apply technique, cooking technique to that beef. And you apply it, okay, cool. But you can have the best technique in the world, you can go out and buy the most expensive steak in the world, but if you can't execute it, then it doesn't matter. So this could be a 10. This could be a 10. If this is a 1, if your execution suffers, then it's a nothing. And that's one of the things that cookbooks in general do not teach you. They don't teach you how to handle the stress of cooking for 8 people. They don't teach you how to make decisions on the fly, how to use that intuition and be like, you know what? It's winter. It's cold. My plates are freezing. They need to go in the oven. You know, I need to make sure I bring my sauce back to a boil. All these different things. So we're going to focus a lot on execution this week. You're going to, obviously be executing in the kitchen all week. But what's more important is on your final day, you're going to take your execution and your understanding of flavor structure, and you're going to create your own dish and execute it. And we're going to go through all that stuff with you. So let's start with flavor, because flavor is really the most important thing. That's the first question that you're going to ask yourself when you're walking down the road of creating a new dish. What will I be cooking? And it sounds very simplistic, but when it should be. The whole entire formula is about simplifying your approach to food with this knowledge and this skill to execute. So you say to yourself, well, I'm going to cook chicken, right? Well, automatically, you're eliminating certain ingredients. You're eliminating certain techniques, right? So you're making this conscious decision. You have this thought process in your head of, okay, well, if I'm going to be cooking chicken, well, what part of the chicken? Am I going to be cooking chicken breast? Am I going to be cooking chicken legs? Because the techniques that are applicable to the breast aren't the same techniques that are applicable to leg and thigh. And we'll talk a lot about that on our technique day. But first you have to construct flavors, which we very creatively call flavor structure. So this is where I start. When I'm going to create a new dish, I start with flavor structure. I ask myself, well, what's my new dish going to be? Oh, I'm going to do a short rib dish. Okay, so that's my starting point. But there's not this mind-boggling creativity that goes into creating a complex flavor structure. What goes into creating a good, solid, complex flavor structure, which really isn't that complex, is the understanding of the 5 basic flavors, the 5 basic tastes. And I'm sure you guys have seen these before, you've heard about them, right? Salty, sour, sweet, bitter, and umami. And these are the 5 major flavors that actually register on our tongue, on our taste buds. And a lot of the complexity of our flavor comes from aroma. About 70 to almost upwards of 85% of our perception of complex flavors comes from aroma, the olfactory system. But these flavors need to be in harmony. They need to balance one another when you're constructing dishes. And they contrast, mute, and balance each other. So salty and sour, very complementary, right? Margarita, lime, salt, it's delicious, okay? Bitter, you have something that's bitter, like a bitter green. Sweet balances. Salty and sweet will balance one another. Sweet obviously balances sour. So if you have a dish that's sweet, but it's maybe a little cloying, and it's one-dimensional, add a little bit of vinegar, okay? Add a little bit of lemon juice. Add some sour. And then you have umami, which is savory. That's your savory, meaty, mushroomy, roasted flavors, okay? All right, so that's it for flavor. Let's go to the kitchen and cook. Just kidding. All right, so that's the overview. Now let's get into this, okay? Let's start with salt. Salt, super important, obviously. Without a well-seasoned dish, without salt in your food, it's just never going to taste right. It's going to taste bland, pure and simple. The number one mistake that I see with amateur cooks who are new to cooking is they under-season their food. Now, this doesn't mean you should be making a salt bomb, okay? The seasoning in your food, the salt in your food shouldn't be perceptible unless you're doing something where you actually want it to be like crazy, like, like salt and pepper chicken wings. But for the most part, salt is there to enhance flavors. Now, how does salt enhance flavors? Well, we have salt on our palate. On our saliva, naturally, we have salt. We need salt to function, right? It's how our body, it's a natural mineral element that if we're deprived of, we're going to die. So our saliva contains about 0.4% salt in the saliva by weight. So anything below that threshold is going to taste off. It's going to taste under-seasoned, right? If you've ever baked a loaf of bread and forgot to leave the salt, or you forgot to put the salt in, I have. It's horrible, right? It tastes like cardboard. Comes out of the oven fresh and hot. It looks great, smells great, looks like bread. Now, but when you bite into a baguette, you don't say, hey, this baguette's salty. You say, hey, this tastes like a baguette. This is great, freshly baked. But it will literally taste stale, like cardboard. So what that means is you have a seasoning threshold of a bare minimum of 0.5% by weight to 1% by weight. So you could literally take a whole batch of soup and go through your entire cooking process. You get to the end, right? Never adding a single amount of salt to it. Put the whole thing on the scale, taking into account the weight of the pot, which you can just hit the tare button and pour it in, right? You add 0.5% to 1% salt by weight, boom, it's seasoned. You're there. Now you have to take into consideration, obviously, personal preference. If you're cooking for someone who's on a low sodium diet, they're going to have a much higher sensitivity to salt than someone who's just eating a normal diet who's not overly concerned about it. But this will at least get you in the ballpark. And because this is so important to have properly seasoned food, because constructing flavors, when you start adding layers of complexity, such as sour and bitter and sweet, you have to have your seasoning right. So this takes the guesswork out. So if you're like, I'm unsure, I don't know, and we're going to be tasting a lot of food together this week, side by side, okay? But if you say to yourself, I'm not really sure how much salt to add, this will get you in the ballpark. And you do this for a little while. You do this with some dishes. And then you taste it, and you get a sense of seasoning. And then if it still seems bland, that's when you move into your other flavors. And you start building contrasting flavors on top, layer after layer after layer. Okay? Now, all salt is salt in the sense of sodium chloride. Okay? This is our seasoning salt. Any chemists in the crowd? No? You? Are you a chemist? Okay. Good, so I can tell you lies and you won't even know. So, the word salt in a scientific term is a very, very broad category, right? But sodium chloride is what we call salt in our common vernacular of, hey, pass the salt, okay? And you see all different kinds of forms of salt existing in the world. Some will cost you upwards of $30 a pound. You're like, well, why is that, right? Because it all is just sodium chloride. That's it, it's sodium chloride. So what makes salt special isn't its chemical makeup, it's the shape. And shape is very important. Okay? So let's go through the various salts that you're going to come across and make the decision of whether or not you'll be purchasing them. Okay? So the first one is table salt, also known as iodized salt. And this is because a very small amount, in the tune of about 0.8% of iodide is added to table salt to prevent against goiter, which is still a major issue in third world countries. But being spoiled first world people, we get plenty of iodine in our diet from other substances. So we don't really need it anymore. It's kind of like a relic of the past. When people see, iodized salt, it's a blanket. It's comforting. It's what mom uses, right? So iodized salt is the stuff that you find in the salt shakers on your table, right? And under a microscope, it looks like that. You see that neat trick? Could have gone to art school. It's a dense crystal. It's a dense, compact, square crystal. No jagged edges. It doesn't dissolve that quickly, and it bounces around, right? So when you shake it onto something, a lot of times it's bouncing off your food, unless it's really moist. Like you got like a big bowl of spaghetti, and you shake it on top, okay? But it has no texture. It's very, very small. So it's just there to add salt or seasoning. But also, so iodide itself is somewhat volatile, and it oxidizes rather easily. So they have various different forms of antioxidants that they put in with iodine in very, very small amounts. One is the sodium ferrocyanide that just helps to kind of keep it from deteriorating and oxidizing. But also, even though they put a stabilizer in, iodized salt is volatile at high temperatures, about 350 plus. And it will oxidize at high temperatures, and it'll break down, become acrid. So, if you've ever eaten something, like a seared steak, or something that was put on a hot grill, that was seasoned with iodized salt beforehand, and you get that little metallic tinge in the back of your throat, the kind of like acrid tinge, like, what's that? That's kind of weird. That's the broken down iodide. So because of that, so let's think about this for a second. Searing a steak, above 350, yes. Grilling, yes. Baking bread, yes. My oven's at about 525 when I bake my baguettes. So iodized salt is out for anything that requires me to use high heat. So that leaves me for cold heat applications, what we call a finishing salt. But because of its compact, dense crystal, because it's small, it's not a very good finishing salt. It doesn't really adhere to anything, right? So for me, iodized salt literally has no place in my kitchen. It's not good for cooking. It's not good for finishing. Those are my two options. Now, if you have a jar of iodized salt at home and you're making a soup, and you can use it for that. If you're boiling pasta, you can use it for that. Salt your pasta water. But outside of that, iodized salt to me really doesn't have much of a place in my kitchen. So my go-to cooking salt is kosher. And this would be more accurately described as kosher ring salt, because technically all salt is kosher in the sense that you can eat it within the Jewish religion. So it's not the fact that they actually make the salt kosher. It's the fact that the salt is used in the koshering process, which is to purify meats by drawing out the blood. And so you have kosher salt, has large crystals. And this is a very, very detailed drawing that I've worked on forever. But they're jagged, right? And these jagged crystals are meant specifically to adhere to meat. Right, so you can salt it and it'll adhere and it'll draw out the blood and you rinse it, and that's part of the koshering process. So this makes it great for seasoning meat before I cook it, because it's literally manufactured to stick to meat. It also, you can find forms of kosher salt with iodine added, which they basically do it again, mainly to transition people from table salt to kosher salt, because people still think that they need iodine in their salt. But most of the major brands that you find at the supermarket don't contain iodine. It's just straight up kosher salt, right? So you can season a steak with it. It's going to stick to your steak, and you can sear it really hard on both sides, and you don't have to worry about the iodine breaking down and giving you an acrid flavor. So what's nice about kosher salt too is it's inexpensive, and it's also large, so you can see how much you're putting on a product. Whereas if you're sitting there with a salt shaker of iodized salt, you can sprinkle it all day long, and it's going to take a lot of salt to actually be able to visually see it. But also too, you'll get used to the feel in your hand, right? So for me, I use Diamond Crystal kosher salt, not because it's the best kosher salt out there, but it's because what I've always used. And when you pick up salt between your fingers all day long, every day for a decade, when someone switches out on you, you have a nervous breakdown. You're like, what's that? But also, too, I've gotten to the point where I've measured what a pinch is. Because someone asked me before, Jacob, what do you mean by a pinch of salt? Well, damn, that's kind of a good question. So, for me, personally, and I have sausage fingers, so your mileage may vary, is 1 finger per gram. 2 finger pinch, 2 grams of salt. 3 finger pinch, 3 grams of salt. So, and it's accurate as hell. You just pick it up and boom, you're there. So you realize that there's this intuitive sense to seasoning that forms. And that's also why I don't switch out my kosher salt. Because when I'm creating a new dish that I'm working on in the kitchen, I'll season it, right? Taste it. Okay, cool. Now, after about 20 times of doing that repetition, then you don't even think about it. You're like, boom, 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 boom. I know that's the exact amount of salt that food in that pan needs to be seasoned to how I like it, right? So kosher salt is a great all-purpose cooking salt. Then you have your fancy finishing salts, such as the sea salts or the French salt fleur de sel. And fleur de sel is kind of like the king of all finishing sauces or salts. It literally means flower of salt. And with fleur de sel, you have this delicate pyramid structure. And these little circles represent gaps. So it's not solid. So it's very, very fragile. So when you bite into it, you get this subtle crunch, and it almost makes it somewhat sweet. And it has nothing to do with its chemical makeup, because it's still sodium chloride. it has everything to do with how it interacts with your palate. So it delivers this really subtle, salty crunch that's great for finishing. Sprinkle it on the steaks as they go out, right? Sprinkle it on salads. And there's other various types of sea salt that, because of their crystal size, make them good for finishing. You have Maldon salt, which is a big, thick crystal. So you sprinkle that on a grilled steak and get that crunch. You get some texture from it. So what makes sea salt different than kosher salt, technically speaking? Absolutely nothing, especially in the United States. Because as far as the FDA is concerned, which is true, technically speaking, all salt is sea salt. Whether it's inland 2,000 miles because it comes from an ancient seabed that has since dried up, or it's actually a salt mine on the sea, all salt came from the sea. So you could literally have a salt manufacturer creating kosher salt and sea salt side by side, and the only difference is the labeling on the package. But you get to know certain brands, you get to know certain sea salts that you like to use for finishing. Fleur de sel, again, is a great go-to. You will find this in every single high-end fine dining kitchen. If they only have 2 salts, those 2 salts will be kosher salt and fleur de sel. And it adds a different taste perception. You know, that little finishing salt right on top really gives you a nice, good, just kind of spike of saltiness, right? So it's nice when you're eating through a plate of vegetables that are already seasoned well, but then you get this little punch of salt here and this little punch of salt there. And it dissolves quickly on the tongue, so it's there, then it's gone, okay? Now you also have your colored salts and your flavored salts. So you have the smoked sea salt, right? Which they actually they moisten and they smoke, and it gives it a smoky flavor. We have that on our butter that you had at dinner last night. So we sprinkle a little bit of smoked sea salt on our room temperature butter, right? And then you also have lava salts and like pink sand salts, and they're really more there because they look cool, you know. I mean, and there's nothing wrong with that. If you find like a gray salt or a black salt or a pink salt that works well as a finishing salt because it has a good structure and a good crunch to it, and it looks cool on the plate, then use it. You know, there's nothing wrong with that. And now you have also too, the newest, most trendiest salt is the Himalayan. The Himalayan pink salt. And this has been around forever, but now it's trendy because the hippies got their hands on it. And what makes it, you have iron oxide in the salt, which is what makes it actually pink. But there's a ton of other like trace minerals and nutrients. And what they'll say is like, oh, well, I don't use kosher salt. I use Himalayan pink sea salt because it has 83 trace nutrients and minerals in it. And it is really, really good for you, and that's why I look so great, because of salted yoga. Well, it's true that it has trace minerals in it, but if you look at your daily mineral count that you're supposed to be getting from it, they're so minute that you literally have to eat like 1,000 grams of the stuff a day, which would quickly kill you, to get your recommended mineral count from it. So if you have, so I have nothing against vitamins and minerals, but you're probably just better off taking a multivitamin and using the salt that you like. Okay? So that's salt in a nutshell. You're basically looking at salt for cooking and salt for finishing. Now salt, that's seasoning 101. That's flavor 101. Without salt, there is no flavor. Pure and simple. Okay? Seasoning 202 is sour. Once you understand how to season your food, the way you take it to the next level is a little bit of acid. Whether it's vinegar, verjus, and verjus is it's basically like sour grapes or sour fruit that's pressed and highly acidic, but it's never fermented. So it's kind of like a vinegar, but it has a different fresh quality to it. And then you have your citrus. Oranges, lemon, limes, grapefruit. Now, obviously, this isn't the only sour ingredients out there, but these are the major, especially citrus and vinegars. These are the major ones that are going to get you through, okay? And just like salt, especially with the vinegars, you have some that you might want to cook with. They're a little less subdued. And then you have some really high-end, nice ones that you want to finish with or use in like a vinaigrette you want to keep raw. Okay? So, a cooking vinegar could be rice wine, a generic champagne, balsamic, but these can also be used as finishing too. All right, but these are the ones that they have a pretty broad flavor. Unless you're using a really, really high-end aged balsamic, you can cook with it and the flavor is not going to necessarily break down. All right, but your finishing vinegars are going to be something along the lines of, 20-year aged balsamic, Moscato vinegar, aged sherry, all of which we have in the kitchen to play around with. And what I recommend is get yourself a little glass vial with an eyedropper and pop your favorite vinegar in there. Whether it's sherry, Moscato, champagne, even like rice wine vinegar is fine. And everything you cook for a month, just put a couple dots on it. Just a couple drops. Because like salt, acid will help to enhance the flavors of food without being perceptible, without being perceptibly sour. Okay, it's very, very important to actually season things properly. Now, everything you cook isn't going to need a couple of drops of vinegar, but I think it'll really open up your mind to what can be heightened by just a very small amount of acid added to a dish. Now, what makes acid important is its complementary status with the other major flavors. But what's really important is this right here, fat. Now, we're going to talk in a second more about the evolution of our understanding of like flavor perception and how we got to that point, okay? But fat is still debated as to whether or not you can taste fat, if you actually have receptors for fat, okay? I believe that we do. I don't believe it's just amino acids in the fat that make it taste like fat. I think we actually have receptors for it. But even if we don't, what we do know about fat is it's delicious, right? We've evolved to the point where we crave fattening foods, or animal fat specifically, because before we were these lazy, spoiled creatures that live in houses, it saved our lives. It got us through winter, okay? But also fat, even though it gives you a great mouthfeel and body, it coats the palate. And it coats the palate and deadens flavors. So you season something with salt, and you add fat, your flavors are now going to be a little bit off, okay? So you add a little bit of acid, and the acid will cut through. And it'll heighten your perception of that dish. Now, acid will also balance salt, and it's a big time balancer for sweet. I'm a big believer in adding small amounts of citrus to sweet desserts, okay, because it's basically the seasoning of the dessert world, as is salt, which is very commonly overlooked. People think because they're eating something sweet that they don't need salt in it, but it's still food. You still need to season it. So you have just a small a sprinkling of salt on a dessert, and it's going to open up more flavors. And then you throw a couple drops of acid on top, and it's going to open up more flavors. It's going to allow your palate to receive more. So even though a dessert is kind of overarchingly sweet, that's where you build that complexity of flavor. That's the difference between, oh, hey, that's a good dessert, and oh man, that chocolate cake was amazing, right? Because you had an acidic component, you had a salty component. So get yourself some vinegars, definitely, and then you want to stock some citrus fruits. But that's also too like where you go to like a Chinese restaurant, you have like sweet and sour sauce. It's good. It's tons of vinegar balanced with sugar. What's not to like about it? And it gives you that really intense sense of flavor. Okay?
Can you explain like with the sorbet, the strawberry, you have the walnut oil, the fat, and then the salt.
Right.
So could you talk about that?
Yeah, so you all had, except for Daniel, but Daniel's eaten dinner here before, so you've all had our strawberry sorbet last night. And so you look at what makes a sorbet, and it's a simple syrup that's spun, so there's no fat in it. But I love the play of having finishing oils in general. So we put a walnut oil on it. We've also done pecan oil in the past, which is a lot of fun because it literally tastes like a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. It really does. And then you add a little bit of the Maldon sea salt, which is a finishing salt. So it enhances that perception of sweetness. And there's also acid in the sorbet. Both the strawberries are acidic, even though you eat a ripe strawberry, like, oh, it's a sweet strawberry. Part of the complexity of that strawberry is it actually contains a lot of acid. And then we do put a little bit of lime juice in the sorbet as well. So what you have is one little just punch of flavor that has the salt, it has the sweet, it has the acid, and also has the fat. And that fat is really great at carrying flavors. And most aroma molecules that exist, right, that have the complexity of flavor in them, they're fat soluble, but they're not water soluble. And that's actually why we're able to taste those complex molecules, is because what happens is you put these foods that contain aroma molecules into your mouth, they hit your palate, which is water, and they fly off into your olfactory system, and that's how you sense them. You sense them through your nasal cavity. So there is an argument, though, that if a dish contains no fat at all, which sorbet by nature doesn't contain fat, it's just sugar and a water-based liquid, then you're going to be losing some of that complexity of flavor. And also, too, it just trips people out that you put walnut oil on sorbet, It's a lot of fun.
So what was your citrus on the bread pudding last night?
There is none.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's all about personal preference and taste. There's always rules that you adhere to, and then rules that you break consciously. And with the bread pudding, it's just like, look, let's take croissants, let's make a bread pudding, and just douse it in caramel. I mean, like why overthink it? So sweet is the sugars of the world. And it takes parts per million wise, ppm. It takes the most parts per million of a sweet ingredient for it to actually register on our palate than any other ingredient out there. It's about 0.5% by weight. So a little bit more than salt, okay? But not much. And this is because, nature never intended us to go and, extract extract sugar in its purified form, right? This was nature's signal to us like, hey, this is good stuff. You should eat it. This is an apple, this is an orange, this is a carrot, all of which contain a good amount of sugar. And you eat it and it's nutritious for your body. All right, but we went and we refined sugar, which gives us the ability to do lots of great desserts and lots of great things that we couldn't do without raw sugar. But where sweet is very commonly overlooked is as a seasoning. Now again, because you can only register, so because it takes about 0.5% of sugar for you to even think there's something sweet going on. But really, when you combine it with all the other ingredients, you're going to need more. You're probably about 0.75% to 1.5% of sugar. Okay, because just like anything else, it's a combination of ingredients. So if I took a glass of water and I dissolved 0.5% sugar into that water, you might be able to be like, oh, it's kind of sweet. Just barely maybe. There's some perceptible sugar there. Okay, but in a dish, it's a lot harder to pull out, especially since we associate sweet with quality of ingredient. Think about it. Great carrot is sweet. Great tomato is sweet. A great apple is sweet. Okay? So you add, very commonly, like stir-fried vegetables in Asian cuisine. Stir-fried veggies, sugar, just a little sprinkling. The French, they use a tiny bit of sugar in their vegetables, and they call it glaçage, which is basically glazing. So you extract the starches from the vegetables by simmering them slowly, and then you also add a sprinkling of sugar. And as the cooking liquid reduces, it becomes this glace that glazes the vegetables. And it gives you a lot of flavor. And you say to yourself, wow, this is the best carrot I've ever eaten. Well, yeah, because there's a little bit of sugar there that makes the carrot seem of a higher quality. And if they start with a high quality carrot, then it's even more enhanced. But also, too, what else are the French doing? Well, they're going to throw some butter in there to glaze it. So you got your fat, you got your flavor. Butter is tasty. They're going to season it properly. And they're going to add a little acid. Right? So you have these plate of vegetables, you're like, well, this isn't how mom makes them. Well, yeah, it's the four major flavors on the plate in balance and harmony. And the punchline is, they're not overshadowing the vegetables. The vegetables are still the star of the show. Okay? They're there to enhance it. And that's what this entire flavor matrix is about, is adding them in small quantities to enhance your primary ingredient. Now, sweet, excuse me. So sweet balances sour, which is your acid, balances bitter, balances salt, and also it balances piquancy, which is the fancy word for spice. But in the technical food world, we call it piquancy, so we don't confuse ourselves talking about spicy heat and spice as in spice like, pepper and cinnamon and cloves, that sort of thing. The red curry sauce last night has a good amount of sugar in it, okay? Because it would blow your palate wide open without it. Okay, fat balances heat and sugar balances heat. So we have some fat in the sense of, or in the form of coconut milk in the curry broth, and we add a little bit of sugar to it. And that helps us balance out. And we're going to talk about our approach to that sauce in a second when we talk about the flavor punch, which is a concept that I like to discuss because it allows you to sort of understand an approach to making a really bold flavor, but it can become overbearing as well. Okay?
So the piquancy is heat?
Yeah. Piquancy is heat. And it's also piquancy it envelops a category of pungency as well. So your mustards, raw onions, or garlic, anything that has a pungent flavor falls under the heading of piquancy. But mostly we talk about piquancy as heat, as chili peppers, jalapenos, things you get. And that's all based on the Scoville scale. So people talk about, this pepper has 500,000 Scoville units. And what's interesting, so we were just talking about how sweetness balances piquancy or heat. That's how they figure out the Scoville units of a pepper. So they'll take a precise amount of the pepper, they will dissolve it into a sugar water solution, and the units of sugar that they have to add to that water, so when you sip it, you can no longer perceive the heat, is 1 Scoville unit. And it has, and that's why they usually have a range, because there is always perception involved. That's why you'll see the range of 350 million, 350,000 to 500,000 Scoville units for something like a habanero. But it's about perception. But that shows you right there just how sweet can have a deadening component on the piquancy of a dish. You can balance that piquancy with a little bit of sweetness. Now, just like with sweetness, bitter is, actually, probably don't need another, oops, we'll take this back. We'll just add bitter to the bottom of this guy. Because in the same sense that you need the least amount of sweet, it's the most amount parts per million of a sugar substance for it to register on your tongue, you need the least amount of bitter. And this is because in nature, bitter things are usually poisonous. We associate them with things that will kill us if we eat them, right? So this is our body saying, hey, this is bitter. You might not want to eat this. That might not be a good idea. But it's a very, very important flavor, especially in its ability to balance sweet, and also in its ability to cut other ingredients such as fat. So bitter greens on a rich dish, it's a great garnish, okay? If you want to serve an endive salad, you use a sweet vinaigrette or sweet dressing. You have like honey in there, or maybe add a little bit of sugar or molasses, because you need to counterbalance that bitter with sugar, with sweet, to bring it into focus. But again, the way that we taste is we taste it as one cohesive unit in our mouth. So that's why a lot of the time you'll look at something and you'll taste a vinaigrette. And you'll be like, that vinaigrette is really, really sweet. Like, it's almost too sweet. Well, it's all about context and application. If I was going to dress an apple with a sweet vinaigrette, probably wouldn't be that good. There'd be no contrast. But if I'm going to dress endive or dress frisee with a sweet vinaigrette, it's going to be very much complementary. I remember working at a French restaurant in San Francisco, and they did an orange sauce, like an orange butter sauce with their lobster tail. And I was just an intern at the time, and I tasted the orange sauce, like, it's horrible. It tastes like orange pith, like it's really, really bitter. But no, we butter poached the lobster tail. Like, we don't need another rich sauce on top of a rich piece of fish or a rich lobster tail. We need something that puts that into perspective, that cuts through it. And you eat the two together, and it was amazing. It was an amazing flavor combination, right? So you always want to look at adding contrasting components to your dish and finding a balance. But now that you know that they balance, you can be like, it's a little too bitter. Well, what do you need? You need some sugar. Just add some honey. Find a way to add some more sweetness. Fatty dish, really, really rich. What am I going to do with all that fat? Well, what balances fat? Acid balances fat. Piquancy balances fat. Bitter balances fat. Cuts through. Boom. So you have various options open to you. The beef bourguignon that we're going to be making later this week, that we had on the menu last night. It's a really rich dish in the sense that we use a non-starch thickened demi-glace, which equates to about 30 gallons of veal stock, reduced down to 1 gallon. And then we slowly braise the chunks of beef in that. We mount the sauce with some butter, right? It gives you that beautiful, rich, velvety, winter-like mouthfeel and flavor that you want. But it's rich. It needs some contrast. So we add piquancy in the form of pungency with a little bit of Dijon mustard, which if I don't tell you there's Dijon in it, you wouldn't really know, right? It's just there to kind of add a depth of flavor. A little bit of sherry vinegar, right? Mounted in right at the end. And then we garnish with frisée. Frisée is a bitter green. So we're using various different components from the bitter frisée to the acid from the vinegar and the pungency from the mustard, all to balance fat. Not because we're geniuses, but because we're like, hey, it's a fatty dish. Let's balance it. Now, what we just discussed, salt, sour, sweet, bitter, was the 4 major flavors that were put forth by this guy, Dieter Hannig, German scientist, in 1901. And he wrote a paper, and he said, hey, that whole complex flavor thing that's been puzzling us forever, I just figured it out. And which is funny because it's just theoretical anyways, but it's cool, it's 1901. And he said, here's the deal, here's how we taste. This region right here, this is sweet. This region right here, and on here, on the front side of the tongue, this is salt. This region right here, on the back side of the tongue, is sour. And then, on the very back of your tongue, you have bitter. And these were the 4 major flavors, and he basically said that, hey, every single flavor that you taste is a combination thereof. Okay? Then you had Mr. Kadune Ikeda come along, Japanese physicist, and story goes, he was at home eating a bowl of his wife's soup in Japan, right? And this had came out, and he was just kind of thinking about it, and he was sipping on this soup, and he was, there's something here. There's something here that isn't bitter, that isn't sour, that isn't sweet, that isn't salty. It's something that's delicious, that's satisfying, that I can't put my finger on. But I know it's there. So he asks his wife, he says, hey, what'd you put in this? What's your secret to this amazing soup? Why is it so good? And she said, well, I put kombu. And kombu is a form of seaweed. And you'll see it at stores. It comes in dried sheets. If you've ever made dashi, it's one of the key components to dashi, which is the base broth in Japan that they use to make miso and any number of glazes. Okay? So Ikeda says, hey, I'm going to figure this thing out. I'm going to figure out what this is and what it's doing, because it's neither salty, sweet, sour, or bitter. It's doing something else. It's giving a delicious flavor, okay? And so, in 1909, his work was done, and he discovered umami, which quite literally translates to delicious, right? And umami was formed by free-form glutamic acids. And there's such a high concentration of glutamates. So glutamic acid, when it's fermented or it's dried or it's roasted, goes through a chemical process where it turns into a free-form glutamate that actually gives us the sense of savory. And you can even see the glutamates crystallize on the kombu itself. Okay, so he discovered and put forth this sensation of savory that is caused by glutamic acid, which you find in mushrooms, tomatoes, cheese, meats, breast milk, all contain glutamic acids. And it gives you this savory flavor. So he goes and he refines it. He starts a company called Essence of Taste, right? Ajinomoto, which translates into Essence of Taste. That's what his company was. And he extracts free-form glutamates from food, and then he stabilizes it with salt. Okay? Sodium chloride. So this gives you monosodium glutamate, better known as MSG. With devil horns. But not really. Okay, MSG is the most hysterical, overhyped misinformation craziness that's ever occurred in the culinary world. Okay? And it was all started by Dr. Robert Koch, and he writes a letter to the editor in the New England Journal of Medicine. Just a letter to the editor, nothing peer-reviewed or anything like that. Just writes him a letter and says, hey, I've noticed that when I go to a Chinese restaurant and eat Chinese food, I get headaches and I get a numbness in my shoulder and I sometimes get nauseous and all these things, but it only lasts for a couple of hours. And then the symptoms are gone. And they actually called this CRS, which stands for Chinese Restaurant Syndrome. Very, very, what a fascinating medical term, right? So then, the next year, Science Magazine comes out with an article that was never really peer-reviewed, basically just making the assumption of saying, hey, there's this new sort of thing going on where we believe that the MSG and the free-form glutamates that are found in Chinese food make people have these symptoms, right? And because Science Magazine said it, well, hell, it must be true, right? So literally a handful of doctors, after that, when people would go and describe certain symptoms to them and say, hey, doc, I've been having trouble with migraines lately. I've been having a little numbness in my shoulder. They say, well, hey, when's the last time you ate Chinese food? Well, hell, I ate Chinese food like 2 days ago. That's it. You have an MSG sensitivity. Boom, right? Now, glutamate is a neurotransmitter, okay? It's part of our memory function. We produce 40 grams of free-form glutamate every day in our body just so our brain can communicate with itself, can record memories, can transmit back and forth. Salt, we need this for our cellular function. We need sodium in our diet. So we literally have the sodium ion that we find in sodium chloride mixed with glutamate, which is naturally produced by our body. And then there's this hysteria of like, this is going to kill you. This is going to give you migraines. And what's more likely is the fact that, I don't know about you, but I love eating some salty Chinese food, but salt bloats you, right? Maybe you're like, oh, salt. Also, there's people who have gluten sensitivities, which people are just now finding out about. It has nothing to do with being celiac or allergic. Gluten will make you gassy. It can give you headaches, And that's just if you happen to be a small portion of the population that is allergic to it. Maybe you had a nut allergy that you didn't know about. All these things are very commonly found in Chinese food, right? So don't be afraid of MSG because basically the purified form of the glutamates that are found in some of our favorite foods. Parmesan cheese has a ton of free-form glutamates. That's why it tastes awesome on a big bowl of pasta. Okay? You almost use it as a seasoning. Now, they also had two other, so the free-form glutamates aren't the only thing that cause an umami sensation. Okay, you also have inosine monophosphate, and this is found in skipjack tuna. And then you have guanosine, monophosphate, and this was discovered in shiitake mushrooms. Now, skipjack tuna, they catch it, they dry it, they smoke it, they shave it, and that becomes what's known as katsuobushi. Katsuobushi. Is anyone seeing a trend form here? These are all very commonly used ingredients in Japanese food. And katsuobushi and kombu are both the bases of making dashi. And what they've found is the inosine monophosphate and the guanosine monophosphate, along with monosodium glutamate, they have a synergistic relationship. So you add one to a dish, and you get that umami flavor. You're like, oh, that's good. You add two to the dish, and they create an umami bomb, where you're just tasting like, oh man, that's so good. Well, it's because they actually literally have a synergistic relationship where they work better together than separate. So you look at dashi, again, which is a major building block for Japanese cuisine. That's how they get so much of their savory flavors. And you talk about really wanting to blow someone's mind, make them a bowl of miso soup with the addition of rehydrated shiitake mushrooms in it. Okay? You're going to have a really full, amazing flavor that's really, really powerful, and it's extremely savory. Right? It's going to be hard to replicate somewhere else. So, the moral of this story is have savory ingredients in your kitchen. Fish sauce is great. right? I came up in French kitchens. They never had fish sauce. I married a Filipino woman who showed me the virtues of fish sauce, which is everything, right? You can put fish sauce on cereal and it'll taste good. All right, I might have exaggerated a little bit. Now, what's funny is for Western cultures, usually our first introduction of fish sauce is a really, really strong dish at a Southeast Asian restaurant. And you're like, oh, it's so fishy. Like, it's an acquired taste, right? But fish sauce can be used as a seasoning, just like salt and acid and sugar can, where it's imperceptible. We add it for just purely for the glutamic acids that are in the fish sauce. You know, I like to drizzle a little bit on my tomatoes, and it makes them amazing. Tomatoes and fish sauce together are great. And if you look in the umami section of your curriculum, I have a little chart for you of all the ingredients, not all the ingredients, but a lot of the major ingredients that contain umami. I believe it's on around page 17 or 20, somewhere in that area.
MSG.
One question
Yeah.
about that chart. So is that really right? I mean, the map that it...
No.
Okay.
Sorry, so this is incorrect. So what they found is you have what's called papillae, and I totally just butchered that pronunciation, but basically, if you stick your tongue out in the mirror, all those visible dots that you have are taste buds. And every taste bud, so you have about 50 taste buds per dot, and every taste bud has, a couple hundred receptors. And this is all over your tongue. You have receptors in your throat. You have receptors actually on the sides, the insides of your cheek. And so our sense of flavor is very, very complex, and they're still just scientifically wrapping their minds around it. And the most recent studies show that we can taste a lot more than even the 5 basic flavors. Because so far, it's been shown that a lot of the complexity in flavor does come from the volatile aroma molecules that fly off into our olfactory system, and that they give us that complexity. But that's always been sort of the cop-out as well. We can taste 5 flavors, and then all the complexity comes from aroma, and people were fine with that because we were still able to make good food, because it was a baseline understanding. But now all the really geeky guys are saying, no, I believe you can taste some acids. I believe you have receptors for fats, and they're trying to prove that. But in the sense of being a cook in a kitchen, it doesn't really matter. I mean, it does because, I'm a geek and I like to understand these things. But you take into consideration that our sense of taste is extremely complex, but it has very basic building blocks. You have the 5 major flavors, and you have some aroma, you have some fat, you have some piquancy. Now, the reason why piquancy or heat isn't considered a taste is because it's a sensation. It actually it burns you a little bit, right? Or it gives you the perception of burning. But the tactile sensations are something that's extremely important in cooking. That's why you need texture in a dish, right? You need to have a crunch. If you're serving someone a soup that's a pureed soup, you want to add a little bit of a crunchy substance in there. That's why you give them a crouton or you garnish with a nice crisp green, okay? Because what happens is if you don't have that crunch, if you don't have that tactile sensation, you get this. Palate fatigue. And this is what stops you dead in your tracks. Okay? So what is palate fatigue? Well, I'm out hiking all day, and I'm starving, right? And I haven't eaten all day. And so the one thing I want, that I'm craving, is I want to go have a big steak dinner. Oh, that sounds so good, okay? So I sit down, like, give me the 22-ounce ribeye. Let's do this. Okay, I'm hungry. I haven't eaten all day. And, I'll take the baked potato along with it. Maybe some veggies. Maybe I'll start with a salad and pretend like I'm eating healthy, okay? And so you get this big 22-ounce ribeye sitting on the plate here. And maybe they give you like some veggies and stuff like that. Okay. A little garnish. And you take the first bite. And like, oh, so good. So good. I'm so hungry. Oh my God. So you take another bite. And you take another bite. You take another bite. And you take another bite. And about 6 ounces into the steak, you're like, oh, yeah, I think I'm kind of over this whole steak thing. Like, can I see a dessert menu? I'll just take this thing to go. You know, and that's palate fatigue. It's one-dimensional. Now, what you need to understand, though, which is really important, because people will talk about palate fatigue. You're like, okay, cool. Well, so, don't serve a 22-ounce steak. That's kind of ridiculous anyways. Yeah, I get it. What you understand, though, is as cooks, what we do is we create experiences. Pure and simple. We create experiences. Think about some of the most memorable experiences in your life, and they usually surround food. The food may not be the centerpiece of that experience. I'm not going to let a burnt turkey ruin my Christmas day, right? Because I still have family and friends. But as part of our culture, we create memories around food. And that means that as cooks, we have the ability to play even a small role in someone's special memories. And they can link those memories to that food. Now, what does that have to do with palate fatigue? Well, remember that first bite of steak? And you're like, oh, this is the best thing I've ever eaten, ever, ever, ever. And then you're about 20 bites in, and what do? You push it away. And that's your last memory of that food, of that steak. So even though logically I can say to myself, well, my eyes were bigger than my stomach and I shouldn't have ordered a 22-ounce steak in the first place. Psychologically, in my head, that steak wasn't as good as it could have been because I didn't finish it. I pushed it away. I made the conscious decision to be like, yep, I don't want that anymore. When you serve a dish to somebody, and that's why plating and presentation is very important. That's why you see higher-end restaurants doing tasting menus in smaller portions. It's not because the chefs are cheap. In fact, you go to a really high-end restaurant, just that plate that they're plating their food on costs about $100 a piece. It's because when you push that plate away, they want you to beg for one more bite. Oh, I wish I just had one more bite. That was so good. And then you move on to the next course. And if it's a really great dinner, you have 12 courses, you have 12 dishes of, damn it, why couldn't there just be one more bite on that plate? And it makes the food more memorable. And it makes you perceive that dish to be better, to be of higher quality, okay? So linked, or it can be the converse. Yes, sir.
I used to, just a small story, I tried to duplicate my mother's chopped liver recipe once. Mm-hmm. And I didn't have the recipe, so I kept adding ingredients, a little salt, but it's too salty, so I'd add some more liver, and then I'd add some more egg. And my wife wasn't home while I did this, and it was over a period of about an hour and a half, and I consumed so much chopped liver that when she came into the door, had the big bowl of chopped liver that I was blue in the face, sitting on the floor and shoving the chopped liver over to the dog. We call that chopped liver syndrome.
Yeah.
Fatigue.
You get that. Well, you know what else is actually very interesting about that? So we're talking about the psychological component of palate fatigue. Linked to that is you trying to recreate your mother's or grandmother. Was it your mother? Your mother's chopped liver pate. So this is something called Flavor X Factor. And it's that something special, okay, that you can't really put your finger on. It's those childhood dishes. And because, so the part of our brain that stores long-term memories is very closely linked and associated with our olfactory system, which is responsible for our sense of smell. That's why you can walk into a room and you get a whiff of something and it triggers a memory. And it's very, very powerful. Well, we also know that a large amount of what we taste is based upon aroma. So you can never compete with grandma. I mean, hell, my bolognese might be 10 times better, but to you, it will never be that good because you're not standing at grandma's knee watching her cook. You know, those smells filling the room. You didn't just open up a bunch of presents on Christmas Day and have those senses of joy and those feelings that go along with it, right? So it's hard to compete with that, but what you can do is you can harness this. You can harness the flavor X factor through aroma, through fun, whimsical plays. So you take something from your childhood or you take something from your guest's childhood and you try and replicate it, but you try and replicate it in your own fashion, in your own way, right? To kind of trigger those emotions without competing with grandma because you're never going to win. A good example of this is a modernist chef, Grant Achatz, chef owner of Alinea in Chicago. He had this dish that he would call fall. And it was, one small course in his, 20 plus course tasting menu. And it was a little bite of food, it was a little dumpling that was skewered with an oak branch and held in this crazy little squid-looking metal thing, right? And they'd walk it out, and on the end of that oak branch, they had oak leaves that they would burn and blow out, and they'd take them out into the kitchen, into the dining room, and it would be smoldering. So you have the smoldering oak leaves. And you pick up the little bite of food, and you take the bite while inhaling, naturally, the smoldering smoke leaves, and you call the dish fall. And where I grew up in the foothills, tons of oak leaves. That's a very powerful memory, right? I mean, I get chills just thinking about it. You spend all day raking leaves with Dad. You have the big pile, then he yells at you because you go jump in it, you got to re-rake it, and then at the end of the day, you burn it. You stand around and you watch the fire burn, okay? It's a very, very genius, creative move by Chef Achatz to even think about that, to harness that, okay? So, and that's where the flavor X factor comes in. There's little things that if you think and you try and you study and you meditate on that subject, you can get little bits of inspiration. And you can say, hey, I can take this to the next level. And it could be just as simple as doing a play on a grilled cheese and tomato soup, which, I don't know about you, but that's what my mom always made me when I was sick at home from school. And even though I was sick, it's a great memory because I wasn't at school. So, yes?
I was going to say that the duck confit Reuben is that for me when I walk into your restaurant. That's one of the things I always think about. And is he going to serve that?
Mm-hmm.
It just...
Well, as you see, we retired that to a bite. And so you'll see that a lot. A lot of my dishes are inspired by things that I love to eat, right? And I was sitting at a diner and I was eating a Reuben sandwich. And I was like, yeah, you know what? Maybe I'll just turn Stella into a sandwich joint for a while because I really want to make a Reuben. Because I love baking bread. You have the cabbage, which there's all this amazing science that goes into making sauerkraut that you could do, and you make your cabbage. And you have your pickles, you have the whole process of pickling and creating those flavors through the pickles. And then you have the meat that's cured and it's slow roasted and cooked, and you get that pastrami flavor. And then you have the complexity of the rye in the dish. So even though it's a simple Reuben, there's a lot of great fun things that go into it. And then you say, hey, I'm going to make a Reuben from scratch, but now I got to sell it for $30. Right? So the way that we did that is our duck breast. We use a pastrami cure on it, but very light. So we didn't actually cure the meat. We just season it with the pastrami curing spices, and we cook it sous vide so it kind of uptakes some of that flavor. And then we would serve it on a little homemade piece of rye bread with the sauerkraut and garnished with pickles and a little bit of demi-glace. And people are like, what, sweet pickles and ducks? Have you lost your mind? Like, no, it tastes great on a Reuben. Why wouldn't it taste good on a duck breast that's cured to taste like pastrami? So that was our take on it. And so we try and we try and have a simple yet complex approach, if that makes sense, in the sense that, okay, we're going to do a Reuben sandwich. These are the flavors that make a Reuben sandwich. Now, everything needs to be made from scratch and be reconstructed so it fits the flavor profile of a duck breast, not a deli sandwich. Okay? So that was kind of our attempt at Flavor X Factor. All right? So when you're making certain items, you want to take into consideration that you could cause palate fatigue. But, if I'm at home making a big batch of spaghetti, I'm going to serve a big batch of spaghetti with, a side of salad, and we're just going to eat it. That's going to be our dinner. Don't overthink it. But if you are having a dinner party, that's why it's nice to start off with some little canapes, little bite-sized hors d'oeuvres, They have a couple of bites of that, and then maybe they move to a simple salad or a simple cheese plate. And you move to, a simple meat option. And by serving multiple courses, you control the amount or the serving amount that any one item or any one person gets from that item. And so you can create a stronger perception of that item's flavor when they remember it. So with that in mind, with palate fatigue in mind, I want to talk about flavor interruption and flavor punch. So a flavor punch is how you create a really bold, aggressive, assertive dish that still has balance to it. But these are the dishes that you serve as small courses or as canapes or as a component that's balanced out by other objects in the dish because it can very easily cause palate fatigue. So what do I mean by flavor punch? I mean, boom! Flavor punch to the mouth, right? You take a sip of something and it hits you. Like, wow, that is real strong, okay? And here's how we do it. I learned this trick from studying Southeast Asian cuisine and Asian cuisine in general, but specifically Southeast Asia because they do this all the time. And they usually start with piquancy, but you don't have to. You can start with bitter. You can start with salt. You can start with sweet, okay? So let's take a piquant ingredient. We'll draw a chili. That looks like a chili, right? Kind of. We'll color it red so it looks like. Okay, so there's our chili. That's our base. And we take our chili and we blow it way out into left field. Boom! Oh my God, that's spicy! Ah! Spicy! Hot! Then we reel it back in. We reel it back in using our understanding of flavor structure and how components contrast and balance. So, how do we reel that back in? Shout it out, I know you know.
Sweet.
Sweet. Fat. Salt would more season it. But basically, these are going to be the two biggies, is sweet and fat. Who had our coconut curry dish last night? Right? So the albacore is served on top, and the albacore has a nice little bit of fattiness to it. Okay? But what we do is when we make this sauce, it's actually very simple. We use aromatics, ginger, galangal, a little bit of onion, some garlic. We sweat them down, add a little bit of wine to it, cook out the wine, add in coconut milk, okay? And then at that point, you basically have something that, tastes like coconut milk that's kind of funky because you have like the ginger and the galangal in there. So you have like these perfumey aromatic ingredients, okay? Then we add a bunch of red curry paste until it's offensively hot, okay? Well, not offensively hot, but till where it's pretty hot, okay? And because that red curry paste is basically cooked down aromatics and chilies, it has a really sort of astringent quality to it as well. So you taste at that stage, you're like, oh, this is horrible. Like this is It's not even salvageable, right? But then we add sugar. We add our sweet. And then we also have the fat from the coconut milk that's rounding out those spicy flavors. Okay? Yes?
Which means you would never buy the low-fat coconut milk.
They make that?
Yeah, they do. They do. Just asking, sorry.
No. Well, the thing is I'm not a dietitian, if you haven't been able to tell yet. It's my job to teach you how to create flavors on a professional level. But when I go home and cook for my family on my days off, I'm not going to cook them Stella-style dishes every single night. And that's not to say that every dish that you get at Stella is unhealthy. In fact, there's quite a few that are a little bit higher in fat, but are still very healthy for you, lots of nutrients and well balanced. But sometimes you got to bring out the big guns. I'm not going to take the time to make a red curry sauce at home for myself. If I'm craving it, I'll just go out to a Thai place or something. But if you want to do something special, now you have the tools to do that, right? So no low-fat coconut milk. But that's basically a flavor punch approach. And that's why when you taste that coconut curry sauce, it's fairly intense. And we get that intensity, it's not intense in the sense of overpowering, but it's intense in the sense of complexity. You have a hard time putting your finger on the background flavors that make it what it is. But it's just a very simple formula. Aromatics that are sweated to release some of their aroma and some of their flavor. That has a background hint to it. And we, boom, blow the spice out into left field, reel it back in with sweet and fat. But you could just as easily do that with sweet. You could do that with bitter. You can do that with any of the major flavor components. Okay? Now, a flavor interruption this is a mid-dish palate cleanser. So in the sense of the coconut red curry, right? You're eating it. It's good. And we have some other components in there that you kind of work your way around to. But there's certain dishes that are just homogeneous by nature, right? It is what it is. You have a bowl of tomato soup, it's tomato soup, and it tastes good. Now, what I like to do, not with every dish, but I like to do with some dishes, is you create a flavor interruption. And a good example of that is this is our beef bourguignon dish. Okay, and we got some beef and we got some vegetables in here. And it sits in a nice, rich pool of sauce, of that reduced demi-glace. And then I garnish just with a little bit of green frisee. Right there. Okay, just a couple key places on the plate. It looks good, adds visual contrast. But what happens is, so you have these complex flavors that are created by the whole process of sweating the aromatics and braising the beef. And so you're eating this beef, and that's the main component. You're like, this is good braised beef. Tastes delicious, yummy, right? But you kind of work your way around the plate, and then boom, you get a little spoonful of frisee on it. And what does that do? The frisee is bitter. Bitter balances fat, bitter balances richness. So it cuts through on the palate, and it resets your palate. So it saves this dish from becoming too one-dimensional, right? And so you kind of have these little interruptions around the plate. Now, so you can do this with any balancing ingredient depending upon what the main flavor profile of your dish is, right? So if you have a sweet dish, you can have little pockets of spice. Sometimes we garnish our desserts with piquant powders. We'll use Burberry. We'll use some Togarashi. We'll use a little bit of cayenne. And you can either use it as a seasoning component, where you're adding it to be a part of the homogeneous flavor profile of that dish, or you can add it in little pockets. So they get sweet, 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 spicy. Sweet, 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 spicy. And so what it's doing is adding interest and complexity to the dish while they're eating it, and sort of resetting their palate every 4 to 5 bites. Okay. All right. Any questions on flavor structure?
Will you be talking about, it seems like everything is salt and pepper to taste. And so I just find it salt and pepper to taste. So it's salt and pepper.
Yeah.
And, it's black pepper.
Well, that's why I gave you.
Little component and then salt and then,
Well, so that's why I gave you the ratio of salt. Yeah. So that way, if you have a question of like, if you don't think you're adding enough salt or maybe you're adding too much, that'll give you a baseline. But salt is a seasoning, pepper is a flavoring. And so for whatever reason in our culture, salt and pepper, salt and pepper, salt and pepper. Now, if you look at what pepper is a form of piquancy, right? It's kind of pungent. And most dishes need some form of pungency or complexity that a spice like pepper will bring. But that doesn't mean that every dish needs pepper. Pepper is just a tool to make that happen. So in our kitchen, when we're cooking during service, we don't keep pepper on the line unless it's for a very specified reason. Because it's, number one, pepper has its place, but it interferes with wine big time. So if I have an over peppered dish and you order a really nice bottle of wine, you're not going to enjoy that wine as much. But also too, because of salt and pepper, cooks always grab salt and pepper. And I don't want all my dishes to contain pepper, because pepper is a flavor. So if you eat multiple dishes time and time again that all contain pepper, then you're going to have the same flavor in every single dish, and you're going to get bored. You're going to get palate fatigue.
Yeah, I understand that. Yeah, you see it all the time. Mm-hmm. You see it on cooking shows and talk, So,
well, people don't even think about it. They just do it. And that's really the main focus of this course and this curriculum, is consciously thinking about every step that you make in the kitchen. And then once you've identified those steps and you've thought about it, then it becomes second nature. You start creating your own style. If you love pepper, then cool, that's part of your style. Put pepper in everything. I'm not here to tell you not to do that. But be making the conscious decision of putting pepper in everything. Okay?
There's different kinds of peppers too.
Absolutely.
Right.
White pepper, green pepper. White pepper smells kind of like a barnyard, so it can add some complexity sometimes. It's kind of nice. There's certain French dishes that just don't taste right without white pepper in it. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the duck press. How do you use it?
I'm sorry?
The duck press, you mentioned that earlier.
Oh, I think I said duck breast, but a duck press is cool too. So if you go to like a really like old school fancy fine dining restaurant, what they do is they whole roast a duck very slow, and they wheel it out on this big fancy like silver cart, and then the maitre d' carves off the two breasts, places them on the plate, and then he takes the rest of the duck, leg and bones and everything, and shoves it into this big brass cylinder with a crank on the top, and he cranks it, and it presses out the juices and some of the blood that's left over in the bones into a pan, and they usually add like a little bit of cognac, and they bring that to a simmer, and they reduce it, and you have this very flavorful, pure sauce that's made literally from pressed duck.
Well, I had it once, and I've never forgotten it.
Yeah, isn't it amazing? Yeah, it's very simple, but it's definitely a luxury, because the press itself costs about like $10,000, and you got to pay the guy to wheel out your silver cart, and you're basically just cutting off two breasts, and you're pressing the rest of the duck into a sauce. But it's pretty fantastic. Any more questions? Okay, so let's take a 15-minute break, get some coffee, stretch our legs. I want to introduce you real quick to, that's Ben and Zach in the back there. Those are my sous chefs, so they'll be helping out this week. One of the cool things about our boot camp that I think is really cool is we're actually professional working cooks. So being able to cook alongside one of my sous chefs or myself is going to give you that sort of intensity that you might not get in a regular culinary school environment. I know I didn't get it when I was in that environment for a year and a half. So that's the fun part. but we'll come back here after 15 minutes. We're going to do our menu meeting, kind of plan for the day, and then we'll go and we'll cook some lunch. Okay?